a great scholar of cinema, Professor Ismail Xavier. Professor Xavier has been central to the study of Brazilian cinema across no less than 5 decades, beginning with the cinematographic discourse and the seventh art from 1977 and 1978 respectively, and continuing with seminal studies of major directors like Glauber Rocha, apologies for my Portuguese, and D.W. Griffith, and further incisive discussions of cinema form, cinema history, and pedagogy, including The Look and the Scene, Modern Brazilian Cinema, and Allegories of Underdevelopment, New Cinema, Tropicalism, Marginal Cinema. Through these major books, and his essays in journals and anthologies, and through his visiting professorships at New York University, the Université de Paris 3, and the universities of Iowa, Chicago, Leeds, and Buenos Aires, Professor Xavier has brought his insights to bear on a wide range of filmmaking practices and histories, winning the Luiz Bertrell Prize for Communication Sciences from the Brazilian Society of Interdisciplinary Communication Studies in recognition of his achievements. Among other cinemas, he's led the scholarly community in the study of Brazilian cinema, a cinema whose histories and legacies he is committed to protecting, not just in his writing, but through his long-standing work with the Cinemateca Brasileira, and we were honoured to make a visit to that institution last year in his company. Today, Professor Xavier takes us to an example of contemporary Brazilian video art which speaks urgently to the concerns of this very conference, intermediality and the moving form of film. So please join me in welcoming him.
Ok. Good morning. Não tem... bom, acho que... I think you all can hear me without any problem. Okay, first of all, I have to say thanks to the organizers of this colloquium, especially Lucia Najib, with whom I was in touch all the time. And again, it's a new chapter in our relationship and cooperation in film studies and research. And I'm very glad to be here. It's the first time in the University of Reading, and it's always a very good experience to exchange with you all that are here. So I will do something a little different today concerning an experimental video that was made in, the first version was 2008, and it was part of a doctoral dissertation of Carlos Adriano doctoral dissertation. I was his advisor at that moment, and later he gave a final shape for this experimental video in 2010. And now, before showing the entire piece, which has around 14 minutes, and instead of showing clips, I think it's better to see it from beginning to end. I will give some information about it because it's interesting in terms of the historical research that was done in order to make it. This video, which is called Santosco pio Dumontagem by Carlos Adriano, is inserted in a constellation of works that emphasize a process of repetition and difference that establishes itself as a structural key presiding the spectator's interaction with images and sounds. On the flat surface of the video, we found a reassembly of a scene, highlighting the conversation between two notorious characters in the beginning of the 20th century. Santos Dumont, the Brazilian who played a central part in the invention of the aircraft, and Charles Stewart Rawls, one of the partners who founded the Rolls-Royce enterprise, which was at that time and even today, involved in the production of jet turbines for planes, etc. This scene was filmed in London in 1901. The videomaker came across this information during a research carried on in New York while searching for data on a device he had seen during a visit to the Museum Paulista of the University of São Paulo in the room dedicated to Santos Dumont collection. The museologists from the institution ignored the origin of the device. They thought that was something that he had invented because it was there, and it was deposited by Santos Dumont's brother when Santos Dumont died. And they were, trying to identify all the pieces there, and this piece was a kind of mysterious thing for them. And Adriano examined its structure, and particularly the arrangement of the material fitted to a reel inside it. It consisted of 1658 cards with photographs and 658 cards with photographs and 664 blanket cards, alternated and arranged on a kind of reel that, while turning, allowed the activation of a projection by a crank movement controlled by the user. It was the mutoscope, a device that Hermann Kessler invented and patented in 1894, which had been exploited by the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, a company from New York. And this device was explored by the Biograph Company since 1896. So one thing that is important here is the mutoscope depended on the previous existence of a film. It's not a press cinema device. It was invented at the same time of, the cinematograph by Lumière or by Edison. And the major difference between the mutoscope and the film itself is that the mutoscope became an attraction, and at the same time that in screen rooms and fairs, we had the exhibition of the great novelty that was the cinematograph, which would become the most popular form of entertainment. But the wealthier classes used these gadgets like the mutoscope as a way of home entertainment. So the difference between cinema and the mutoscope is that the mutoscope was produced to a very differentiated kind of consumption, like many other devices invented in the 19th century. The mutoscope depended, as I said, on a previous existence of a film that should last between 30 and 60 seconds, a very short film. A film whose frames were enlarged in the photographic posters, arranged in a circle in the device. Like other moving image devices invented throughout the 19th century, it was individually handled. And then he allowed for the projection to be held at the desired pace. The owner could play with, speed, go on, go back, etc. It was one of the toys for domestic use that allowed its owner to enjoy the pleasure derived by this passage from still to moving image. So the major difference to cinema was the conditions of of projection and of spectatorship. Adriano rebuilt the 55-second film he found. He rebuilt the 55-second film that had given rise to the photographic material found in the mutoscope in São Paulo Museum, and created an experimental video that lasts about 15 minutes. using digital strategies of fragmentation and recomposition of the scene and even of its frames, he created a very original choreography given that he used the archival material not to make a compilation film, a kind of documentary bringing a portrait of a historical time, as is usual in found footage films, these compilation films. No, this is a completely different case in which he explores the moving image in its formal malleability. That's the idea of experimental work. It's the very texture of the image and all kinds of operations that can be done with this material that are at the center of his work. And he makes a film in which the aesthetic dimension affirms itself, intertwined with an already secular configuration of the visual arts, marked by the advance of image technologies. So it's really an experimental video that has a very strong connection with visual arts in general, not specifically with cinema, although cinema is part of the game. This field, which involves the network built between the 19th century and the 20th century, brought to the foreground by the film's construction, exploring, these repetitions of iconic motifs that configure the experience following a theme and variation scheme, like a musical composition, as I said. This experience is carried out with a Baroque, ludic, poetic posture that gives a special color to its reflective, conceptual impulse, characteristic of an experiment that exposed the technical procedures and the very meta of the media itself. There are things that I almost made a comment during the projection, but I thought it was not the best way. We listened to Caetano Veloso, that he has his thanks to Caetano because, he made that for the film, talking about Asa, wing, and Asa in the deep blue and the dream of aviation and destiny. There is a very synthetic composition of a poetic lyrics, and Caetano did that just to create some kind of atmosphere. And he also plays a very well-known samba that he quotes, because one of the things I will comment on is the fact that the film makes allusion to a series of things from the Belle Époque, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, including the fashion of clothes. And it's funny because when he is manipulating that sheet, it seems like a wing. Because of the repetition, it seems like a wing. The sheet in which supposedly we have a project there, is in this animation turns into a wing, and on the other side also turns into a kind of dress of women with babados in Portuguese. I don't know in English. When it's very open and to the wind, etc. And so he makes some kinds of humoristic comments about the fact that among the things in that epoch, it's not only the epopeia of scientific and technological development represented by those two notorious figures, and all other kinds of things that were happening at that time. And so I will just go on with my comments here to talk about the way he deals with all this subject related not only to the specific question of mutoscope cinema and all this reflexivity that is very clear, but also with some kind of a chronicle view of that period. First of all, there is this idea of the mutoscope as part of what later would call the philosophical toys, as the zoetrope, the phenakistoscope, the Santoscope, and other devices were called, philosophical toys, which created a moving image from drawing or photographs. Such philosophical toys created an illusion of movement more and more precise as the different kinds of inventions came, revealing at the same time the mechanism that produced such effect, generating a great interest by this combination of entertainment and technological advance. In other words, what was valued was, on one hand, the immediate desired sense of the device's magical effect, and, on the other hand, the knowledge, somehow placed in parentheses, of the technical frame generating the effect. Because the owner, for instance, of those domestic devices, he knew how the thing was produced. It was clear. All those devices were very clear in their mechanisms. So it's not something that like film, that is, you have a dark room and you have a screening that you don't see the projection, the projector, etc. So it's interesting. There is a kind of home consumption of a technology of image that has a different principle in terms of reception of the effect created by this passage from still image to moving image. So there was this connotation of a charming and prodigious thing that might have been more effective given the more incipient stage of that, what we call disenchantment of the world. I use here Max Weber's formula to talk about this process that has been increasingly associated with the technical scientific advancement and its instrumentality. Our notion of techniques and science is completely different from what happened in that period. This idea of disenchantment of the world, this idea of the instrumentality and all the problems involved in the technological advance were not a thing that people would discuss at that point. Today, considering the immense repertoire accumulated for more than a century of experiences in the field of image technologies, the forms of reception present in the context of video art are marked by a greater coefficient of conceptual debate when compared with the experience of the philosophical toys. Such a difference does not exclude the magical side of the fascination which, although it may be repressed by a blasé aspect in the gaze of our days, has its place in the central part of this contemporary experience. In Carlos Adriano's video, the experiment that renews the interest in the 19th century devices is carried out not only through its interaction with the mutoscope. The past is evoked by another reference. After developing the theme of variations, after developing the theme and variations scheme for about 10 minutes around the gestures and the interaction between the bodies, there is a sequence in which the digital animation produces, in its game of mirrors, images typical of the kaleidoscope. Geometric figures rich in symmetries, but fragmented, flexible, following a principle that generates visual patterns that multiply themselves in the composition, but with the appearance of an accidental throw, making us think of the experiments with image transformation devices that around 1817 led to the creation of the kaleidoscope. This is, to a certain extent, a forerunner. Let's say the kaleidoscope, to a certain extent, is a forerunner for this mixture of scientific interest and magical fascination that marked the philosophical toys as domestic amusement, associated with the progress of optical studies and the physiology of vision. Today, the reflection on the old mechanical devices of the moving image, suggested by this video art, has the retrospective dimension of an intermediate work, that makes the 21st century meet the 19th century, given the affinity found in the common experience of conjunctures marked by strong relationship between body, look, perception, and movement. What is particularly noticeable in this video is the perception tuned to that Baroque sense of the word dynamics that sees the order of time modulated by fields of force. The order of time modulated by fields of force, always in tension. An incessant game of attraction and repulsion marks the relationship between the structure of the video and the specific content of the scene, creating a kind of ludic, poetic dimension that contributes to the alternation of our attention between the fascination and the conceptual reflection. We are at the same time invited to have a direct connection with those images. I'm just referring to as a kind of alternation between fascination and the conceptual reflection that marks this aesthetic experiment, focus on intermediality. The intermediality here is among different image technologies. It's not among like theater and cinema, music and cinema, and literature and cinema, etc. Things that I myself and our and the group also of research is doing. What is interesting here is basically it's intermediality placed on the technological side of the thing. His invitation to pleasure rests on the elucidation of the very processes in which the viewer is involved. Processes that refer to the history of the moving image devices ever since the mechanical era to the electronic digital era. That is to say, Santosco pio Dumontagem features, so to speak, the procedures mobilized to make itself a reason for reflection, recalling what Philippe Dubois formulates as the principle when he talks about the relationship between video and cinema. He has a kind of synthesis in one formula, and he says, the video is not an object, it's a state of the image. A state of the image, a form that thinks, a form that thinks. The video thinks what the images, any and all, are, do, or create. The video thinks what the images, any image and all images, are, do, and or create. This is part of his book that was published in Brazil, Cinema Video Godard, in 2004. I say I can't quote the French translation because this book was edited in Brazil before another book he produced later in France. On the other hand, the mobilization of digital techniques to produce a radical plasticity allows for the creation of a constellation of metaphors that connect the moving image devices to the set of resonance of technical and poetic character produced by the field of aviation and its conquests, a field that is the subject of the explanation made by Santos Dumont for Charles Rose, and thus a small studio made into a theater for a cameraman who captures the meeting of the two distinguished men in a respectful manner, showing them together in a, could be an American shot, but that the table creates the sense that we can say it's a medium shot, both together in one single take during the 55 seconds. Charles Rawls, sitting to the left of Dumont, hears the inventor who stands and talks, makes gestures, manipulates calculating instruments, displays the drawing of one of his projects, points his finger at certain details, and sometimes looks at the camera. This looking at the camera is emphasized to, it's a comment on what we all know in Brazil, which was how, the vanity around Santos Dumont, because he was all the time very self-conscious in that theater. And because Charles Rouse doesn't do that, he's more a kind of classical cinema actor. He doesn't acknowledge the presence of the camera, but Santos Dumont is all the time, relating to the camera. He is the central performer, the conductor of the scene. But Rouse also participates, and as a man involved in the automobile and aerial artifacts, conducts his performance with perfect mastery of etiquette in his role of gentle host, very interested in what Dumont has to say. Very briefly, I would mention that in Lisbon, there was a screening of this film just after a colloquium in which Laura Mulvey was in Coimbra. And we both went to Lisbon, and there was a screening of this video, and we were together in a panel to talk about. And Laura Mulvey gave a very interesting class, let's say, about the Englishness related to Charles Rouse's behavior in the film. It was very interesting to see how Laura Mulvey could talk about this question, besides all the interesting things she had to say, because of the spectatorship, that is one of her major works relating to video and cinema, etc. The Brazilian is in England after some experiments conducted in France that had made him well known. And he is in London to receive a prize, although this moment of the film, 1901, is before the prodigious flight in loop with the aircraft 14 bis in the field of Mars in Paris in 1906. The major point of this, let's say, discovery was in 1906, 5 years later, when he used that was an airplane, because he had made experience with the balloon. And this time it was an airplane that he used to make this prodigious flight in 1906. As we have seen, the conversation, as I described, it's not made visible to the viewer of the video in its continuity until the very end. Adriano decided first to fragment it, to manipulate all the material, and just in the final moment, we have a continuous reproduction of the scene. We have 55 seconds of that conversation with no intervention on the part of the film, of the video maker. Let's say the base film of his reassembly is only visible there. That is to say, only after our perception has focused on the radical plasticity of the image in conjunction to the soundtrack. That's the interest point, the conjunction with the soundtrack. Alternately, the digital animation featured Dumont's gestures in his dialogue with Rose, projected together with this texture of pixels of the digital image on the screen, contrasted later to passage that draw and give sound to a movement of cards that evokes the spin made by the crank of the mutoscope. We have a lot of images of the cards, spinning in the mutoscope. This is one way to evoke the materiality of the media implied in this reflection that connects past and present, evoking in a special way the mechanism of this device, taken here as an emblem in the field of entertainment of the electromechanical era of industrial advance, an era that included the invention of cinema as an extension in the aesthetic field of a whole set of technological gears proper of the industrial and transportation machines. Interested in this incidence of technology in the sensitive world and in its ways of triggering a new imagination, the video evokes the connection between the advancement of visual media and that of flying machines, something that Edgar Morin, the anthropologist, pointed out in his book, The Cinema or the Imaginary Man, which includes this correlation between cinema and aviation in its anthropological approach to cinema as an icon of the imaginary in modernity. And this connection is allegorized immediately on the cover of the book. Those who have seen the books, there is on the cover we have a draw in which we have a kind of, in which you have an aircraft of that time in that cinema, and this connection is kind of allegory correlating cinema and the imaginary related to aviation is explicit in Morin's book. And I will just make a parenthesis here just to remember that when I mentioned Elsaesser's book, essay, Elsaesser's essay, New History, an archaeology, a media archaeology, is because he's all the time insisting that we cannot discuss as a linear process all this succession of inventions and create a kind of teleology of progress. You know, so we go from the press cinema to cinema, and then from cinema, post-cinema and digital era. He makes a lot of criticism involving all these teleologies constructed by, sometimes by historians, and also he denies, again, an idea of a cyclical development, like sometimes, for instance, the new history created by the historians of early cinema, like Tom Gunning, André Gaudreau, who presented the idea of the cinema of attractions. You know, that was crucial because it destroyed the teleological construction of, you know, film tend to narrative construction, and then everything that came before was primitive. Remember, there was a moment in which history was looking at the first years of the 20th century as something that was just a kind of preparation for the real cinema. While, you know, the whole new history of early cinema constructs a view that early cinema had its proper system, its proper values, in its proper aesthetics, and then create this idea of a cinema of attractions, inspired in the montage of attractions by Eisenstein. And then the avant-garde, even the historical avant-garde of the 20s, had a kind of affinity with early cinema. We have many texts in which people like Germain Dulac, Epstein, the major filmmakers and theoreticians of the avant-garde of the 20s, they would criticize narrative cinema, and they would look back and say, no, the real, you know, imaginary related to cinema is there in those supposedly primitive films. And when the American avant-garde in the 76 and 70s again came with kind of experimental cinema, they again will evoke the beginning of the century. And again, we have here in the experimental video evoking the beginning of the century. Is a video of attractions, if we could say that. And what is interesting that Elsaesser recognizes this step of, you know, criticizing the teleology of narrative cinema, but at the same time said we have to avoid a new option that would be to construct the idea of cyclical processes, you know, of things returning. Okay, cinema of attractions return in the avant-garde and now return in digital. He's all the time criticizing all the models that try to make a kind of configuration of the entire century, especially that idea that cinema is in between things. For instance, he asks why not television was not called as post-cinema, because cinema was going on. But why we call digital era as post-cinema, and cinema is going on? So he's making this kind of questions, not to get an answer, but to get a proposal of what he called to build this kind of archaeology, taking the whole experience as a network open to different new processes that have to be incorporated without having this attempt to achieve a synthesis. No, now we get, by digital, we say convergency? By digital conversion, no, we got another moment of synthesis. No. He said, no, this doesn't work. We have to deal with a different notion of time in a different sense. And then he goes to this metaphor of archaeology, layers, and other kinds of connections between what happened during this very long time, let's say. Well, and going back to Santos Dumont equals Dumontage, as I mentioned, it's a very good example of the so-called structural film, a form of experiment developed in the 60s and 70s by the American avant-garde artists like Ken Jacobs, Hollis Frampton, Ernie Gear, Michael Snow, among others. Under the label structural film coined by P. Adam Sidney, the author of Visionary Film, which was the first classic dealing with avant-garde, American avant-garde. Under the label of structural film, we have a set of works built from the radical emphasis on the formal exploration of one or more technical procedures of the cinema to create an experience that rigorously follows a formal rule. That is to say, the film's law of formation, in order to give power to our reflection on the relations between our perception, our expectations, and the horizon of thought and certain rhetorical figures of the cinema. In the realm of found footage film, the structural film is an experiment about the ways of reading a film. Again, the idea that is a connection with Dubois talks about video. Video thinks what film it does. So again, the idea of the structural film is an experiment about the ways of reading a film, making one see what one does not see, always in the direction of one's thinking the nature of cinema itself, such as Ken Jacobs did when taking, in 1970, Tom Tom the Piper's Son, a production by the Edison Company of 1905. No, sorry, Biograph, just Biograph Company. The cameraman was Billy Bitzer, who worked with Griffith for a while in the Biograph Company. So Tom Tom the Piper's Son was reassembled in a series of repetitions and permutations that does not hesitate to enlarge and isolate details. The few long shots that compose the original narrative, 1905 film, and you have a long shot, and you have, almost 10 minutes, about a dozen of shots. And what Ken Jacobs did was to cut and to fragment and to create a new decoupage, as we say. And he composed, Ken Jacobs composed the original narrative in a way to make us perceive more, observe each passage of the line of action from a variety of points of view, turning the 8 agitated minutes of the original film into 86 minutes, also agitated as well, with all that constellation of close-ups and details taken from the original images. By enlarging details, reconfiguring actions, reanimating, Adriano dialogues directly with Ken Jacobs in his game of repetitions. The difference is that his video, Adriano's video, is more incisive when it comes to the composition of movements thought to evoke the basic parameters of the film strip and its projection, in contrast to the material texture of the digital video. There is, for example, an evocation of the rapid intermittence of the image on the screen using the flickering technique. And there are passages in which the technique of animation underlines the gestures by their repetitions to accentuate a motive of the mechanical era. The gesture of opening a large sheet of paper over the table, which repeated in slow motion evokes a wing. It's a metaphor. Dumont's finger spin, which seen in detail, reinforces the reference to a propeller. The repetition of his theatrical way of manipulating the tea roller and the old calculator ruler as symbols of the inventor's practice. The assembly of the choreography that involves the two characters in a robotized pas de deux. They are robotized. Sometimes is carried out on the sound of a weaving machine, sometimes on the sound of locomotive, sometimes on the sound of a sewing machine, sometimes on the side of a press, and sometimes on the sound of telegraphic transmission. All things that are typical of that period. So the invention is related to, the aviation is related to all those electromechanical devices that are typical of that moment in history. We all know how many historians and critics made that connection between cinema and the train. And here he goes to other kinds of connections, even going to the weaving machine in the factories, and going to the press and the sewing machine, etc. There is, by the orchestration of these procedures, a playful attention on Dumont as an inventor bricoleur, not properly a scientist of mathematical rigor. He's a bricoleur, not properly a scientist of mathematical rigor, but one who knows how to create with the elements at his disposal, to think of unexpected connections in a transverse way with which the filmmaker identifies himself. Let's say there is a kind of identification. Okay, I'm a bricoleur too, this filmmaker is saying, you know, to think unexpected connections in transverse way. And this ludic approach gives some sort of irony to the ballet mécanique made from the human bodies of two notorious figures who find here in this digital spelling their common measure with everything else that composes the image. In the new structure of the fragmented scene, there are two attractions to gain an ergometric aspect in this assembly line that in the soundtrack brings a passage from a samba by Noel Rosa and João Minas called De Babado, a samba composed in 1936, to associate these notorious characters of the science field and its progress in the Belle Époque to the cuttings and seams that evoke Paris fashion and worldly bourgeois life. There is a mention of what I call the babado, and almost, no, I bought it in Paris. It was just an ironic view of the composer of samba about the new fashion in Brazil coming from Paris. If the muroscope scene of 1901 evoked respect by the interlocutors who observed it, the video sometimes deals humorously with a theater that is drawn in the performances, in which they mirror each other when subjected to the parameters of a pantomime or variety spectacle. Commented on the soundtrack, which at a certain point includes an allusion to circus. Remember that kind of percussion of circus in the screen does this kind of spinning? And it's clear that we are with a soundtrack that usually would refer to a circus spectacle. That's some passage of humor in this kind of allusion. The prestidigitation moments deconstruct the ceremonial associated with those icons of technological progress and brings to our reflection a kind of montage of attractions that we could say slightly inspired by Eisenstein because of this kind of varied show structure. The video celebrates intermediate relationships playing with the video celebrates intermediate relationships playing with the elective affinities, connecting different moments of the aesthetic experimentation that punctuated the relationship between technique and imagery, whether in the philosophical toys period or in that early cinema of attractions that deeply captivated the European avant-garde filmmakers in the 20s and those of the American avant-garde in the 60s and 70s. A remarkable moment of dissident appropriation of technological modernization that marked the cultural industry of the 20th century. Again, when I make this reference of this repetition and connection, cinema of attractions, philosophical toys, and experimental videos, I have in mind what Elsaesser said, be careful not to create this kind of cyclical idea of history, etc. So, last comment on past and present I will make now. To conclude, I have a final comment on this mirroring aspect produced by the comparison between the philosophical toys, partially from the press cinema, because the mutoscope is simultaneous to cinema, and what we call post-cinema. That is a problematic notion developed in this video. I believe that in this comparison we have an experience that opens our perception in some ways to what Walter Benjamin called the dialectical image. That is to say, an image that marks a direct connection between two moments in time, an image that does not assume the linear path of retreat to the past, but is immediately constituted in the clash between the two poles, past and present. Okay, I'm finishing. Thank you. Again, this remark here, talking about the dialectical image, is to say that how inspiring is this idea of montage, direct connection between two moments very separated in history, and all kinds of reflections and new intuitions it produces without creating a specific kind of theory, as could be made without a careful examination. In some ways, it's not to precipitate an attempt to build a kind of configuration that explains everything, etc. This experimental video is an experience that suggests an always present intermediality that evidences the dynamics of the relationship between technique and aesthetics, between the gaze and the matter that constitute moving images, a matter which the digital field comes to transform, given the plasticity that reaches the infraframe level and more radically amplifies the world of the visual forms available to our perception. Such images and sounds may or may not find their reference in the outside world, in the social historical space we inhabit, but they are always endowed with an effect of meaning. They are always endowed with an effect of meaning, a meaning that may come from the most radical deconstructive self-reference or from intermedial games with archival material from different origins, operations that imply a spin of our memory, with historical aesthetic implications of different sorts. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail, for a
Thank you.
fascinating talk, and what a wonderful opportunity to see the film, the video art itself. Okay, so we'll open for questions. Yes.
Thank you for your great talk. My question relates to methodology, I guess. You mentioned that the intermediality of this work that we just saw, that is observed in terms of like a relationship between different image technologies. Something that is often, I think, studied also through the lens of media archaeology, which you've also mentioned. So my question is, where does intermediality begin and media archaeology end? So is intermediality concerned more with media that are not directly related to cinema, and media archaeology concerned with media that is inserted within an image that is more cinematic, if you will? So that is a genuine question. Like where, I mean, because it seems that these two methods, they they run parallel courses, yes, but I'm not sure if they meet, and if they do, I would be interested to know what you think about this.
Okay, thanks for your question. What I have to say is, again, based on what Elsaesser himself proposes, because when he starts talking about models of film history or media history, etc., he not only talks about the fact that we have to incorporate all kinds of inventions of, let's say, technological innovations on different levels that apparently have nothing to do with cinema. And I think what is interesting in this video is that he evokes the fact that, you know, that conversation on aviation in his own work is part of a set of innovations that are in industry in general, in different kinds. Because he says that, you know, any of those inventions, like for instance television, you know, is a kind of combination of things related to technology, to forms of production, and to reception. He said sometimes people forget that. Doesn't include reception as one of the questions that should be presented. Like he says, you know, for example, TV, when it started in the late 40s, early 50s, you know, became, you know, the most popular entertainment, and this did not produce the idea that we had something that we could say post-cinema, because it was clear that cinema continued and gradually, you know, started some kind of articulation with television. You know, it took some time for both having some kind of articulation, or let's say integration in terms of the industrial system. But anyhow, you know, the questions related to aesthetics, in a way, they have to be included in his proposal, like film genres, like all the discussion between classical cinema and modern cinema or avant-garde cinema. So what he's trying to propose is something very, very, very general, encompassing all those aspects. But it's a kind of essay that it's more a kind of very systematic criticism of models already placed by historians, and a very vague proposal, I would say. You know? And he goes to Michel Foucault and very briefly evokes the idea of creating this archaeology as Foucault created the idea of archaeology of sciences. But he doesn't develop that part. And I decided to include this reference to Elsaesser, because when it's funny, when I was already working on this, and I had a sense to be more, let's say, entrapped in those attempts to build some kind of a cyclical configuration of history, or just criticizing, you know, linear causality, criticizing teleologies, but trying to replace that for another great system to encompass everything. And then his texts call our attention to, let's be careful, Because, for instance, now, he even reminds us one thing that is interesting. After the digital, development of image technology, some people forget that the videotape, the analogical videotape, already did many things that the digital continues to make. So it's not why we forgot the so-called videotape, the analogical video, as if the digital is a radical break that makes the analogical video kind of passing moment. It's a way of creating a kind of hierarchy that should be discussed, not placed as a kind of dogmatic statement. And sometimes it goes back to different kinds of questions related to reception, and goes to, again, remind us, like I did in the multiscope, no, it's not press cinema. It's something that was there, and dependent on the existence, a previous existence of a film, to be, with all the photograms amplified to cards, etc., and then put inside the device. And all this kind of simultaneous, presence of different kind of technologies working together, each one in its own way of creating some kind of reception system, each one having its own mode of production, etc. And this kind of simultaneous presence of all those different media technologies should be more explored in research. In a way, he's trying to say, let's go slower. Let's be careful in this kinds of synthesis that we all the time testify. Like today, the digital is the convergency, and that's a kind of key moment that will retrospectively allow us to understand the whole process. But the other aspects of what we could say content, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of style, are mentioned as part of the game. But it's very vague in his. There is no. He doesn't practice the archaeology of media.
Can I just say that he's not alone? Like media archaeology is almost like a subfield at the moment. So
Yeah.
Many, I would say that Elsaesser is only one voice among many, and that media archaeology has a wide purpose, as does intermediality. So I'm just interested in terms of what does the media in media archaeology refer to, and what does the media in intermediality refer to? Are they referring to the same things?
Sometimes the same media, yes.
Yeah, because I'm not sure that we are.
I think too. I think yes, because any kind of if we think in terms of intermedia, relating, perhaps I don't know what kind of attitude a media archaeology would have with the connection between film and literature, because literature is not an image technology. It's a print technology. It's a different kind of. Yeah, that's a good question, and I think I will have to repeat your own question. I have no answer.
I'm asking myself.
I have no answer.
We can continue to discuss, I guess, through the rest of the conference. We have a question here.
I wonder if there's an answer to my question. I was thinking about the role of mysticality in these terms, because you mentioned the use of the term philosophical toys, and then you mentioned whether there's still connection, or what's the relationship between these kind of practices with a reference in reality, in the outside world. So I was thinking, because what experimental, and then you talked about how the experimental films play with the malleability of the images themselves. So I was thinking, one of the things that a lot of these media share is that they are based on photography, which is defined largely by lexicality. So I was wondering where lexicality lies in this kind of manipulation with, or playing with the malleability of images. Do you think it becomes a way of kind of separating out the image from completely disconnecting from the real world, and then in the play with speed and movement and the way it's changing the way you see it, whether that becomes a way of reflecting about reality, or you think it's like it becomes something like a reflection of the image, or
No, when you take photographs or films as the basic material taken to explore all kinds of forms in this reflexive movement, the indexality doesn't disappear. Because we were all the time looking at Santos Dumont and Charles Rose, and this indexality is there. It's not lost. What is lost is the idea of continuity. It's the idea of space-time correlated with sense of reality. But any work dealing with photographs will have to deal with the question of the origin of the process. Because we know that the photographic image lost its ontological connection with indexicality, because the digital image doesn't have this kind of connection. It can just preserve it if it wants, but a digital image can be built in different ways that destroy the whole idea of indexality that was the photochemical picture. But depending on the way it's done, this kind of experimental film will preserve some kind of indexicality. For instance, the indexicality here is crucial, because the fact that we continue to see those two characters and that scene shot in 1901 while we are following all those formal constructions is part of the game. He will never question the fact that this is Santos Dumont and this is Charles Rose, even when they are robotized, as I call the ergometric factor in this idea of body positions and work. But the indexality is there on a certain level. That depends on the case, I suppose.
I think I was wondering whether, more like whether because there is indexicality, there will always be a connection with, it will always be a connection with reality as opposed to becoming completely independent.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah, to a certain extent. As any documentary, made in the 1950s or 40s, etc., keeps its indexality in each shot, but the editing creates, a new world. So the indexality in film is part of the game, but never, this kind of testifying the connection with the real world. And here, the formal experimentation is more radical, so the indexality is embedded in a different kind of game. But I think that in some cases, experimental digital video, relies on a kind of indexicality that's at the origin of the material to manipulate it. Sometimes not. Sometimes it works like any visual artist creating images, but that's another kind of experimental video. Okay.
We've got time for one more question, so.
You referred to Dubois' comment about video as a form of thinking, about cinema, but about the image generally. The question that I have is that with digital animation, what is specific to the kind of thinking that we get here in digital forms of video, rather than the kind of thinking that we got with animated video, which was when Dubois was actually making the comment. So this is the latest stage. Are we at a point with the digital with digital animation, where we had not just thinking, but the overwhelming of thought.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. I quoted here Philippe Dubois because it fitted this case. But this formula that could be, when quoted without its context, in a way, you're right, you point a limit to this kind of definition. But, it's exactly when he's talking about video and Godard. And one of the works is talking about le scénario de passion, when Godard makes videos based on his own films. And some experiments made, including by well-known filmmakers, in which the video is a way of going back to his own work or going back to a certain work to think in video, to think that previous work, not writing about it, but making a video. In this case is the formula, the Philippe Dubois formula works, but you're right, it's not a universal formula that all videos are, they think what cinema does. No.
So what is distinct to this kind of
To this case, is that he's all the time, making references to the fact that that mutoscope was based on a kind of celebration of this man. There is a well-known figure who is a visitor who comes to receive a prize and this, generates a film that was produced in 1901 with this absolutely symbolic dialogue between two men who were completely inside the entire question of technological advance. And the fact that when Adriano does all kinds of choreographies around those two bodies, he is making reference to things that haven't everything to do with them. You have to keep that you have these two persons on the screen to let's say, think about the metaphors he's creating all the time, related to film, aviation, technological innovation at that time, with social relationships, because, there is a kind of mundane reference to Santos Dumont in his trip to different countries in Europe, all the social connections that were involved in that production of a new artifact or aircraft like he did. So what we have all the time is the production of effects of something that make us think, that they demand this indexality present there. They demand the fact that we know that this is a 1901 encountering two, notorious figures of that time. You never forget that.
Okay, lovely way to end back with the film. Thank you so much, Ismail, and let's thank Ismail for his fantastic talk. And we'll go to